Welcome to Rethink Your Recalls, where you'll learn how to bring in more revenue and increase patient care while saving valuable time for your staff. We'll look at some of the ways practices have traditionally contacted patients to schedule recall visits and offer some ideas for making those patient communications more efficient and effective. First, let's start with the basics. What is a recall? Traditionally, practices have thought of recalls simply as an annual exam. Maybe an eye exam, an annual physical, or a PAP. Now, though, practices are working hard to bring patients in for a variety of reasons. In addition to these annual type exams, what about compliance screenings, colorectal screenings, mammograms, diabetic screenings? These preventive screenings clearly save lives. However, many practices struggle to get these patients back in the door. Another type of recall is the follow-up visit a provider may recommend at the time the patient is being seen. Maybe a 3, 6, or even 12-month follow-up for a condition or procedure. These recalls are an important part of disease management for ongoing care such as medication management, lifestyle review, or even treatment compliance checks. Then we have the recalls from missed appointments. Even if a patient chose to miss an appointment, it's still the provider's responsibility to bring that patient back in. The last type of recall we'll discuss is the past due recall. Practices struggle with bringing patients back in for even their second visit. We'll look at a case study on Houston Eye Associates, where they realized that 90% of their patients only came in one time during a 3-year period. How does a practice like this get these patients back in the door? Now, let's look at several ways practices have traditionally brought their recalls back into the practice. The most common method has been sending postcards or letters. But it is an extremely time-intensive task to coordinate these mailings. There are other challenges with this method as well. For example, there is no easy way to tell if a patient received this notification. Mailers offer no way for the patient to take immediate action, and the cost is extremely high for the practice. A practice may choose to manually call these patients. Again, this takes a ton of staff time, an average of an hour just for 30 calls. It's estimated that more than 80% of patients aren't even home during the day, so many of these staff hours are spent simply leaving voicemails. Many practices pre-appoint their patients. This is a great idea in theory. However, the majority of patients do not keep these appointments, resulting in a much too fluid schedule and much more time in rescheduling and chasing efforts. And what happens to those patients who chose not to make these appointments so far in advance? Many times, they fall through the cracks, resulting in more of those past due recalls we reviewed a moment ago. Last, because of the obvious difficulties in bringing these recalled patients back in, many practices choose to do nothing. They leave this to the patient to manage. All too often, this results in lost revenue and lost patient care, since the majority of patients don't comply. Next, we'll examine the problem with postage. Employees must take the extra time to print the letters or postcards. They have to deal with licking the stamp, or hopefully at the very least running mailers through a postage machine, and addressing this correspondence. Whether printing an address label or handwriting this information, imagine how much time this takes. These days, there aren't many practices with this much extra time on their hands. Also, postcards and mailers get treated as junk by many patients. Instead of mailing the card and not knowing exactly where it lands, wouldn't it be nice to simply review a report of patients who are contacted? You'll have actual proof that this important information was delivered. Probably the largest hit to the practice with this method is the cost. The U.S. Postal Service has already increased postage costs 6 times in the last 10 years, with talk of yet another increase coming soon. Postage costs for a postcard have risen to 28 cents. And letters to 44 cents. And when you factor in the cost of supplies, practices are looking at about 50 cents for a postcard and 97 cents for a letter. If you are mailing 1,000 of these communications, that's no less than $500. Whether you're a small or large practice, $500 to $1,000 each month can make a huge dent in the bottom line. Are you pre-appointing your patients? You may schedule patients up to 12 months in advance. Although, as we said earlier, most of these patients will need to reschedule anyway. But here's the challenge. How many of us know what will be on our calendar 12 months from now? You may choose to then mail a reminder card a month prior, just to briefly remind them that they have made this appointment. Then you're calling these patients again if they didn't respond to the mailer, and then again with their standard appointment reminders. These patients have a much higher rate of cancellation than your typical patient appointments. How have some of our other practices looked beyond traditional communication methods for their annual appointment strategies? Let's look. Northeast Ohio Eye Surgeons is a great example of a practice that refined their recall process for the most effective results possible. This practice has been using HouseCalls automated messages for quite some time now. They make notifications for appointment reminders, account balance notifications, invitations for satisfaction surveys, and their greatest success so far, recall notifications. Before using HouseCalls automated messages for this process, they mailed postcards for all recall reminders. Their conversion rate was a mere 20%. This means that only 20% of the patients they reached out to actually scheduled their appointments. The process took a lot of time and a lot of money. They estimate the all-inclusive cost of one postcard to be $1.33. At an average of 1,400 recalls monthly, they were spending over $1,800 monthly just in sending these postcards out. The practice then decided to get creative with the process. They sent out a telephone call using HouseCalls at 30 days before the patient is due for an exam. If the patient does not schedule their visit, they send a postcard at the 30-day and 60-day past due marks. If an appointment still hasn't been scheduled by 120 days, they deliver another HouseCalls message. Since making this change, the results have been outstanding. On the first call alone, their conversion rate increased to an average of more than 40%. This means they doubled the number of patients who scheduled that next appointment. The practice even has some months documented at over 70% conversion. Their cost for recalls decreased by over 60%. They eliminated all the staff time spent and doubled their monthly revenue impact. Do the math for your own practice. If you doubled the number of recall visits scheduled, what would that mean for your own bottom line? Our next example takes us to Annapolis OB-GYN. They too were previously sending mailers to their recall patients. Staff was having to manually handle and process these letters, and they found the majority of patients were ignoring the correspondence. This is a huge cost and effort for minimal results. This practice chose to utilize HouseCalls messaging technology for this same outreach. HouseCalls message gave the patients the option of simply pressing a key to transfer back in and schedule their appointment. 24.4% of the patients they called did just that. They transferred right into the office to schedule their visit. These patients pressed the prompt from HouseCalls message, got right to the front desk, and scheduled their visit right then and there. Scheduling and credentialing coordinator Ruth Malinik had this to say: "Our patients are already accustomed to receiving HouseCalls appointment confirmations, and based on our patients' feedback, recall reminders have been a welcome addition to that communication." Patients know that Annapolis OB-GYN will contact them to help them with their continuity of care, not just a blind reminder. Even better, the patients can communicate right back. What do you do about reactivating those long-lost patients? Here's a challenge familiar to many practices. I have all these patients in my database, and there is a segment that have only come to the practice for a single visit. In some cases, it has been several years since they were last seen in the practice. How can I contact and reactivate these patients? It's always going to be tougher for a practice to go out and get new patients. The easier group is the current patient database. These are your low-hanging fruit. Don't lose them. Keep them informed and engaged. Remember, it doesn't matter if you're OB-GYN, cardiovascular, ophthalmology, or even family practice. Every single specialty shares one common task, and that's communicating with their patients. It's important to find the most efficient and cost-effective methods to keep in contact with your current patients. Let's examine how practices are using HouseCalls for their past due recall efforts too. Earlier, we mentioned Houston Eye Associates. They are a great example of this concept. In the past, Houston Eye had been utilizing HouseCalls for appointment reminders only. At some point, they ran some reports and realized that 90% of their patients had not been seen in over 3 years. That is staggering for a business that relies on that annual revenue stream, not to mention the strain it puts on the quality of care they can provide. Houston Eye decided to conduct a test. They arranged for TeleVox to use a sampling of these patients from their database and reach out to them with a message encouraging them to schedule their next visit. Out of this initial sample, 1 out of every 4 patients scheduled a visit. They implemented this process in full and generated 6,000 additional patient visits during a 1-year time frame. The financial results? They increased revenue by $900,000 in the first year of using HouseCalls in this effort. Now, it's important to realize, large or small practice, it's scalable. Even in the smallest practices, if you can bring in 1 out of every 4 of these patients, or even 1 in 10, that will absolutely have a positive impact on your bottom line. If you're like most of today's practices that have seen a reduction in volume, this is simply one way of overcoming that challenge. We've learned what practices have done in the past, what some of the common pitfalls are, and some of the results other practices have seen. Now what? With automated messaging technology such as HouseCalls, you can immediately see a return. Here are some important points for you to know. 1. You have flexibility in how you set up your patient response options. By allowing them to transfer right in to be scheduled, you decrease the lead time and create immediate action. 2. We've reviewed rising postage and mailer costs. You can decrease these expenses by over 60% immediately. 3. Think you have too many patients to call all at one time? Your phones could ring off the hook. No worries though. TeleVox can help you throttle the calls to an appropriate number per day, all throughout the month, to help you streamline the appointment scheduling. You can increase or decrease the number at any time based on your specific results. 4. You can start reaching out to patients who aren't reaching out to you. TeleVox can contact those targeted patients who need to be seen. For example, patients of a certain age or diagnosis group who need a mammogram or colonoscopy, even diabetics who need their dilated eye exam, or patients past due for immunizations. 5. By using HouseCalls for your recalls, you increased revenue without spending any additional staff time. In today's healthcare environment, everyone is trying to do more with less. Here's your chance to do just that. Let's review the key benefits your practice will find when utilizing HouseCalls to deliver your recall notifications. 1. Increased revenue. Houston Eye increased theirs by $900,000 the first year alone. 2. Fill your schedule with desired patients. Keep your schedule full with the patients who need to be seen. 3. Having staff spending hours each day putting together mailers or leaving answering machine messages is ineffective. What other activities can your staff be doing to drive profitability? 4. Patients want to know you're looking out for their best care. Help them follow your treatment guidelines. Let them know they're not just another number by helping them remember what they may have forgotten. And when they are in your office, allow them to interact with your staff instead of watching your staff making phone call after phone call while they wait. 5. Finally, you will have a cost-effective and results-driven way to increase appointments, better than marketing efforts or chasing down difficult-to-find new patients. Learn more about increasing recall appointments through HouseCalls technology by calling 1-800-644-4266, emailing learnmore@televox.com, or visiting www.televox.com.